Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. I'm Amy Treat, and this is Bookmarks. Hello and welcome to Bookmarks. I'm your host, Amy Treat. Political discussions normally center around the amount of power the government should have. Rarely, if ever, do we associate private employers with tyranny or dictatorship. But in a new book, Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It, Elizabeth Anderson takes a critical look at how private companies seek to control the lives of their employees. Dr. Anderson joins us today via Skype. She is Arthur F. Thurnau Professor and John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on democratic theory, equality in political philosophy and American law, racial integration and ethical limits of markets, theories, and value and rational choice, the philosophies of John Stuart Mill and John Dewey, social epistemology and feminist epistemology, and philosophy of science. And joining us to critique the book is Michael Munger, Director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at Duke University. He worked as a staff economist at the Federal Trade Commission and has held teaching jobs at Dartmouth College, the University of Texas, and the University of North Carolina. His recent books including Choosing the Groups and The Thing Itself. His research interests include the study of the morality of exchange and the working of the new middleman economy. Thank you both for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
So, Dr. Anderson, could you give us, in a nutshell, the main thesis of your book?
Sure. So, most of the time in American political discourse, we contrast the market and the government. And markets are said to make us free, and the government is full of regulation. And we also talk as if the employment relation is part of the market. After all, workers can come and go. They can quit if they don't like their job. Employers have the same liberties with respect to their workers. What I argue in my book is that we should actually place the employment relation on the government side of this dichotomy, that employers are basically the leaders of little governments, and the kind of government that they run is, for the most part, a dictatorship in which the workers have very little control or voice in how things are run. So if you look at the constitution of the government of the workplace, unless the workers are represented by a labor union, by and large, they don't have any say in decisions that are being made. They're being ordered around by their boss. And often that kind of power that the boss has over the workers is used in an arbitrary fashion to control not only what workers do on the job and what they're entitled to do, but even to control workers' lives when they are off duty.
And Michael Munger, what is your critique of the book?
Well, I'd like to start out with a compliment of the book. One of the things that Professor Anderson does is one of my pet peeves, and she calls out my team. I'm a libertarian. I'm one of the people, a libertarian economist, in fact. So one of the very satanic people that she's talking about. And we, meaning libertarian economists, tend to use two binaries that really are ideological. They have no good basis in theory. And that is that there's a split between what's voluntary and what's coercive, and there's also a split between states and markets, and the two map onto each other. So the state is always coercive, markets are always voluntary, and what this book does is to problematize that split in a way I think that's very positive. The critique that I would offer is, having said that we should problematize that, the book sometimes is a bit tendentious in the comparison that it makes to calling the workplace a dictatorship. And in fact, on page 55, she compares the dictatorial position of a firm's boss to Mussolini. So it says that Mussolini, you couldn't say that Mussolini was not a dictator just because Italians are allowed to leave Italy. And the fact is that the scope of the control that a firm has, even admitting, all having just said, admitting that there's an involuntary element to it, the scope of the control that firms have over their employees is far less, and the exit option is far more viable. I can leave my job without having to leave the country and my friends behind.
Right, so I acknowledge that in many cases, the cost of exit is higher if one wants to leave one state. Although if you were a citizen of one of the member states of the European Union, you actually have some really excellent exit options there. And for many people who are, stuck in tiny towns and have where the factories have all closed, it's actually very costly for them to find alternative employment if it means they have to leave their friends and family behind. Many of them have found it difficult for them to leave. So while I acknowledge that there are differences in exit costs, it's also the case that the degree of minute control over workers' behavior exercised by managers is quite intensive compared to what liberal democratic states exercise over their citizens.
Dr. Munger, do you have something you want to add to that?
I have a number of questions that I had wanted to ask. And so the way that I come at this is that I have long been interested in the problem about whether exchange is voluntary. And I had a paper in social philosophy and policy in 2011, if anyone's interested in looking at that. And it's a complicated argument, but basically what it has to do with is, do the two sides, the two parties to the bargain, do they have something like an outside option? And so when we talk about power in a bargaining relationship, it's not like a wrestling match. It's not the amount of power we have inside this context. The amount of power that I have is, what's my next best alternative if I refuse to participate? And I think one of the points that Dr. Anderson makes that's very persuasive is there's a really substantial disparity here. That particularly for low-wage jobs, there's a lot of people who are standing ready to take this job if I fire you. And so you're in a position where I, the employer, can abuse you, the worker. Well, what's the outside option for you, the worker? And the answer is that you'll probably lose quite a bit. And when we look at the way jobs work in the United States, and this is not true in Europe, I think one of the things that Dr. Anderson points out is the big disparity. In many ways, workers in Europe are more free. Well, that may be because the outside option of workers in Europe is better. There is a social safety net. There are unemployment benefits, and there's health care. The big difference, I think, is in the United States, your health care is tied to your job. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, from a bargaining point of view, and we may get into this more a little bit later, she has, towards the end of the book, 4 different kind of fiddles. They're not huge changes. And in fact, some of the reviews of the book have been very critical of the fact that she has this very devastating critique and then 4 not very big changes. Well, the changes that she recommends all have to do with workplace governance and due process. My question is, suppose that all we do is improve the bargaining position of workers. That is, we move to single-payer health care like we see in Europe. where your health care is not tied to your job, and either a basic income guarantee or some sort of unemployment compensation where I actually have a better exit option. The way to make a better exit option is to make my outside alternative better. That's not a topic that she takes up here, and I think that would be a nice place for public policy to focus. Now, of course, that's going to get me kicked out of the Libertarian Club. I sound like a social democrat.
Dr. Anderson?
Yeah, well, actually, some libertarians have gotten on the basic income train, and I do think that would definitely be an improvement. So I do discuss the importance of improving workers' exit options. And in particular, I think it's very important for workers to be able to take their skills with them. If they're laboring under a non-compete clause, and we even have low-level workers at Jimmy John's who have to sign a contract saying they can't make sandwiches at a competing shop. You know, I think that's pretty crazy because that would be probably their next best employment option. So if we look abroad at places like Germany and France, they have a system known as Codetermination, in which workers actually have to be consulted on shop floor operations and on certain managerial decisions such as plant closures that have a profound impact on workers' futures. If we look at Germany, workers seem to be doing just fine under this system. Germany is highly competitive. Firms, they don't seem to be really undermined in any significant way. But it really helps workers a lot to secure their dignity at work rather than giving them the only option of leaving if they find that the conditions are too oppressive for them.
Yes, well, I found it very interesting reading your book and just the absolute lack of power employees have in our society. It's very concerning to me. But do you have something you want to add?
Well, we rely on competition among firms to reduce the amount of abuse that workers suffer. And the reason why wages go up is that a productive worker will be hired away. Now, as Dr. Anderson points out, that's pretty plausible if you're talking about sort of top-level university professors or if you're talking about athletes. The question is, how well does it work at the lower levels? Mm-hmm. And I think let's go to something that we might call a sweatshop. Let's think about what we might call a sweatshop. A sweatshop, by definition, people are working in conditions that we think are not really very acceptable. And I ask my Duke students this question sometimes. A lot of clothing that they buy is made in sweatshops. Suppose you went abroad and said, "I am the great white person. I have arrived here to rescue you, and you're all fired." Will they thank me? Well, no. So one of the things I thought was interesting about the book, but would have benefited from some more discussion, although the way you treated Alchian and Demsetz and some of the other theory of the firm work is very interesting, but some work by Oliver Williamson, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, and talked about what he called the fundamental transformation. And in some ways, you're talking about the same thing. Workers have a lot of freedom before they sign an employment contract and enter into an employment relationship. That's when they actually have some leverage. Once they have a job, they may learn things on the job. My boss is a jerk. The conditions are bad. I'm being abused. I don't get to go to the bathroom. I have to wear diapers. Well, that actually constitutes fraud. And that's one of the things that I thought was most persuasive about your due process kind of argument, is that there should be some sort of disclosure and maybe rankings like Yelp, or something online that would allow us to find out more about why disgruntled employees in the past left. But there really is a problem to say, I'm going to go into a sweatshop, this is unacceptable, let's fire all of them. What we need is a solution where the workers can keep that job and yet do something better. So I thought your due process suggestion is probably a pretty good one. I'm not sure how the details would work out, but it's promising and it's not something I had thought of before.
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. This is from Bob Taylor. Do labor unions act as a check on corporate dictatorship? Who would like to take that?
I think they do play a productive role. although what I'm arguing for in my book is to explore some other organizational alternatives. Many workers actually would rather not be in a totally adversarial role with respect to their employers, and that's one of the reasons why many of them shy away from unions. In the U.S. context, there are also huge obstacles to effective organization and a lot of employer intimidation that goes, even if it's illegal, the laws protecting workers to organize are quite weak. And that's one of the reasons why I think we should be looking at codetermination, which offers a cooperative model between employees and their managers in running the firm. It gives workers a voice that's guaranteed, but it's not in an adversarial context. And I think a lot of workers would be more, many of them would be more comfortable in a situation like that than taking an adversarial stand.
Mm-hmm. I think it's difficult in the U.S. to rely on unions. For whatever reason, France and the United States, the adversarial, hostile relations between management and workers is probably going to be difficult to undo that history. But if you look at Germany, Sweden, Japan, something like unions actually have a place at the table, and it's a much more corporatist model of where workers are consulted, where they feel like their opinion is valued and actually benefits the firm. If you look at the relationships between management and unions in Detroit in the automobile industry, it's one of the things that brought the U.S. automobile industry down. I think it may be that you can blame management, which then the union kind of responded in kind. But for whatever reason, unions as they're constituted in the United States, given the adversarial culture, I don't see much hope for them. Although in principle, that's the way to go. You want worker organizations that represent workers at contract time and are able to give information to management in a way that's coherent.
Let's take another question. This one is from Tina Leonard. Isn't the solution more worker mobility, which would discourage companies from being tyrannical towards their employees?
So that would basically be Mike Munger's solution, right? Just improve mobility. And I have some problems with that. There's all kinds of mobility factors that are very difficult for, that aren't just a factor of the workplace, but have to do with workers' lives. So if you look, say, in the city of Detroit, we have lots of workers who don't own a car, and that means they're limited in their job search to a fairly narrow region. We also don't have effective public transportation. Transportation costs just overwhelm them. They might have to take care of dependents who are at school. Housing costs make it too high for them to move to areas with greater employment opportunities. It's just many factors, I think, make exit a very difficult option for a lot of workers, and a lot of employers don't even mind the high turnover. If you look at your typical Amazon warehouse, the warehouse workers turnover, they're churning at an incredible rate, but Amazon seems to be perfectly happy with that arrangement. It doesn't seem to deter them at all. That's why I think that the exit option sounds a lot better than it is when you look at the details of many workers' lives.
Mm-hmm.
These are not mutually exclusive options. I think one of the advantages of a universal basic income, and Professor Anderson's absolutely right, one of the problems is it assumes a mobility that's impractical and maybe impossible, partly because your local benefits, if you're unemployed, you're in Section 8 housing, you're stuck there. If you move somewhere else, it'll take you 6 months or more to get a new set of benefits. Whereas a universal basic income that's administered by the federal government as a negative income tax, I could move from Detroit to Dallas now and start my job, and if I don't have a job, I can at least use the basic income to pay for the moving costs, to pay for childcare. I think she's right about all of that. The question is how to have all of these things improve a little bit. I think the exit option would improve workplace relations by putting some pressure on at least some employers. It's not a panacea, but it's a help at the margin.
Well, I'm all in favor of improving workers' exit options. But empirically, I just think that it does a lot less for people than one might think. My guess, one of my big guesses is that housing costs are shockingly high in the places of job growth. If you look in the Bay Area, New York City, it's really impossible for an ordinary worker to find affordable housing in places like that. And so they're stuck in these areas of high unemployment with no jobs being generated. And I would want to add that this is a place where I think Michael and I could actually be on the same page, because one of the things that I really hate is exclusionary zoning laws that place restrictions on the building of new housing, low-income housing.
I was biting my tongue. So thank you.
It's a disaster. I think it reinforces racial segregation, class segregation. It's an unmitigated disaster, and I would be very much in favor of getting rid of these zoning laws and just letting developers develop more houses. I think that would be one of the great keys, and it would be especially needed in places like California, where they tolerate shocking and very unjust zoning rules.
And that would certainly improve the exit option. It would make it easier for people to sell their houses in the existing place and to find housing in some new place. So I think a comprehensive approach to improving exit options for workers is likely to be part of the solution. I do keep coming back, though, to the due process claims that Professor Anderson makes, that I think a lot more knowledge by workers up front that's enforceable. If we have an agreement that's pretty explicit, spells out some contingencies about how I can be treated, if that's violated, if I have some course of action, then it might very well improve things. I think that one of the things that's interesting about the book that we haven't talked about yet was how you start with talking about the pro-liberty people, the people that were on the left, that were for progress, who saw markets as a means of accomplishing that. But that was before the Industrial Revolution, and Adam Smith pretty explicitly saw the exchange relationship as being cooperative rather than adversarial, including the one that happens in employment. That is, if I hire you and you work for me, we're actually trying to make each other better off, not me as an employer trying to exploit you. You then contrast that with Marx, who pretty much sees exploitation everywhere. Of course, Marx himself never had a job. He just lived off his wife, his partner Jenny's family money until they cut him off. So
Engels.
Well, sure. Engels had to. So Marx, you can understand why Marx really hated jobs. He couldn't imagine someone actually working in one. But the difference between Smith and Marx and the way that you handled those thinkers is such an effective exercise in intellectual history that, regardless of the value of the rest of the book, that's just a very nice thing that I intend to use in class. And I would recommend it to readers, because the conception of the market as something that was liberating is still used now by many advocates of the market, but pretty unreflectively, and you can understand why a lot of people just dismiss it. My side is pretty unpersuasive when they just continue to invoke those tropes that now they don't have a very good basis in fact.
The first half of the book does delve into the intellectual history of free market thinking, and where I make it quite clear that a lot of free marketeers before the Industrial Revolution had a profound sympathy for workers, and especially Adam Smith, but not only him, Tom Paine as well, and that one of the reasons that they thought freeing up markets and abolishing monopoly would be helpful for ordinary workers was that it would be a way to expand their opportunities to employ themselves, to be self-employed, not have to labor under the thumb of some boss who in those days was even more oppressive, because in most cases the employee had to live in the same household as the employer and consequently be a subordinate member of the employer's family. So I want to actually offer a tribute to these early pro-market thinkers. for the way that they thought through some of the implications of anti-monopolization and free market thinking. And where I fault libertarians today is mostly in failing to update their picture of market society to account for the fact that large firms dominate the landscape in a way that prior to the Industrial Revolution was not the case. At least prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was good reason to believe that breaking up monopolies would lead to lots of self-employed people who would be liberated from their bosses. But after the Industrial Revolution, that's not really a feasible thing for most workers.
Outside of the workplace, people have more freedoms than they've ever had. We have, because of the amount of money that the system has generated, I can have, if I'm a middle class person, I can have a car. Now, maybe it's not a $300,000 Tesla, but I have a conversion van where the air conditioner works, it gets good mileage. I have a cell phone, I have a color television. So the differences between the middle class and the upper classes in functional kinds of terms are smaller than they've ever been. Might workers be willing to accept the fact that, yes, the workplace is not great, but it gives me so much wealth that I can then use to increase my freedom and the things that I can do outside of the workplace at night and on weekends?
Right, and what I advocate is that workers should be able to have their cake and eat it too. So I agree with you that the rise of the large-scale modern corporation with lots of workers, lots of employees has enabled an incredibly productive economic system. Nevertheless, I think that workers can have that prosperity and have some security of their dignity and basic rights at work. And it's not going to take really substantial sacrifices of economic productivity.
Okay, that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank Elizabeth Anderson of the University of Michigan for joining us to discuss her book, and Michael Munger of Duke University for offering his critique.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be on your show.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it was a great pleasure to be on your show. Thanks for inviting me.
And thank you for watching Bookmarks. I'm Amy Treat. We'll see you next time.